внук, внук. Пришло время.
I was born in the US but moved to the far eastern Primorsky territory in Russia to follow a dream. When I was a kid, I'd make mixtapes of imaginary radio shows, which I'd give out to my family. Unfortunately, some of my family still has those tapes, something I'll never live down. By the time I reached high school, I knew I wanted to be a radio DJ and began volunteering at a local public broadcast station. Around the time I graduated high school, I began to intern there and had a few chances to host my own show, very, very late at night. When I turned 19, a couple national Russian radio networks were sold by the government and came under private ownership. I grew up in an ethnic Russian household, so I've always spoken fluently. I saw this as my chance and applied for a newly reformatted station in Vladivostok and was hired. This was my first experience after moving to the motherland. It was February 2012, and I was 19. I'd only been in Russia for the last month or so and was staying at the dacha, vacation home, of some distant relative my grandmother had contacted and arranged for me to stay with. The house was pretty traditional, lots of wood carvings, lots of uncleared forest, and this great second uncle, or whatever he was, welcomed me pretty openly. This was a bit of a surprise, as I am what most in the States would call a goth. The only strange thing about living with Uncle Meek was the daily steam baths which everyone gathered for. Hotter than hell and more humid than Florida in the summertime, they could almost make you pass out. I had been working hard to save up enough money to move out, and I found an amazing apartment flat in downtown Vladivostok, near the Russky Island Bridge. They have floodlights illuminating the support cables in the colors of the Russian flag every night. It gave the surrounding area a strange aura all night, which I enjoyed a lot. The building was constructed in 1894, out of red brick, and it was smoky and discolored from over a century of soot, ash, car exhaust, and heavy snow. The inside was amazing. Freshly painted lathe and plaster, wood trim and hardwood floors throughout, plus updated electrical, internet, and cable TV. The apartment was heated by hot water radiators, which was going to take some time to learn, but they were free to use. In the basement of the building was a laundry room and a storage area full of old furniture left by prior tenants, and I was welcome to take anything from the stash I wanted. This was lucky since I had nothing of my own that didn't fit in 3 suitcases. I spent the next couple days getting my internet and TV hooked up, taking some furniture piece by piece up from the basement, and trying to lay the apartment out in some functional style. The building had an elevator, which looked like some kind of 1920s retrofit, grafted into the skeleton of the antique building. A massive iron cage with ominous accordion doors, and a skinny cab that clanked and buzzed with electricity as it chugged up and down from floor to floor. An older lady, who lived about 3 apartments down from me on my floor, stopped in to give me a stern lecture on living in such an old building. I expected her to warn me about the plumbing, or that the hot water took a long time to start flowing. Instead, she told me to mount a cross over every doorway and the main door in my flat. She also warned me against taking the story monster, old monster, which she used to describe the old elevator, between midnight and 5 a.m. She claimed that it would malfunction, but only during those hours. It would take you to random floors or straight to the basement. On occasion, it would even stop between floors and not start working again until exactly 5 o'clock. She also told me to expect to see a lot of black cats around the building. In Russia, unlike the West, black cats are considered good luck, particularly if one walks up to you without being called, so you see them everywhere. They were also to catch the mice, which she told me were emenotak, Russian version of this big, stretching her hands to the size a small dog might be, and laughing hard as if her joke had been worthy of a stand-up gig. That night I went to work at the radio station around 10 p.m. and returned home after 1:30 a.m. Of course, I didn't remember her warning about the elevator and hopped in, taking it up to the 5th floor. The elevator had a lever you had to pull back. Light indicators told you which floor you were on, and you had to push the lever back into place to stop at the proper floor. It took a little practice, but I was able to do it with no real difficulty. It worked exactly the way it was supposed to, and I got off on my floor without a second thought. As I walked down the narrow hallway toward my apartment, I had the sensation that I was being watched. I turned, but of course the hallway was empty. I took several more steps, and once again I felt like someone was there. Actually, right behind me. I spun around as quickly as possible to try and catch whoever was following me off guard. There was only air. When I turned to resume the walk to my apartment, I was startled to see one of the building's various black cats standing off to one side of the hall. It was staring very intently at something back the way I had come. Whatever it was, it seemed to be pretty captivating. I walked toward the cat, but it was fixated on whatever it was watching, its head low and one paw raised as if it was ready to charge at any moment. It was a little creepy, the sensation I had just experienced, and now this random cat acting as if something was there. At first I thought it might have been stalking a mouse, and I looked around a bit to see if I could find one. There were no mice. I was curious, and standing here in this cold hallway watching a cat, watching air was going nowhere. So I whispered, "Hello?" But there was nothing. I tried again in Russian. "Privet." The cat was inching its way toward the spot in the middle of the hallway between where I stood and the elevator doors. A very low growl was starting to escape its little body. The adrenaline started to flow, as I expected something was going to have to happen. The tension building so thickly in the air, the hair on the back of my neck started to stand up. Suddenly, and completely out of nowhere, a very loud thud sound shook the hallway. Literally, you could feel the vibrations through the wood floors. If someone had driven a car into the side of the building, that might have accounted for it. That's how intense it seemed, but the hallway stayed silent. The poor cat freaked, jumped in a wide arc, and disappeared down the hallway in the opposite direction. I took a few heavy breaths and tried to calm down a little. My heart was pounding and my ears felt like they were going to explode. I walked to my door, opened it, and immediately saw what had made the noise. Everything that had been sitting on top of the dining table had somehow fallen off. My suitcases and a heavy wooden trunk I had brought up from the basement to use as a coffee table. They were all on the floor, but not right under the table. More like a few feet away, like someone had pushed them off the edge from the opposite side of the table. Also strange was that as loud as the sound had been, not a single neighbor appeared to have noticed. There were no calls and no sounds of people in the hallway looking for a cause of the massive boom. In the morning, I met a few more of my neighbors on the 5th floor. I asked them each if they had heard the noise from the night before, but none of them really seemed interested in talking about it. A polyclinic dentist who lived in the apartment by the stairs recognized that I had an interesting accent when I spoke Russian. I told him I was from the US and he chuckled a bit. "In Russia, we understand these things." He smiled. "Unpack your suitcases, ghosts hate travelers." I had been living in my new apartment for just over a month now, and it was still almost totally empty. There was plenty of furniture in the basement to choose from, but I was always drained. I had left all my friends and 98% of my family behind when I moved from California to Vladivostok, and I was desperate to make new friends. This meant a lot of clubs, a lot of bars, and plenty of wandering through city parks and department stores, which are actually closer to what you might call a mall in the States. Every night I'd get home late and I'd be exhausted. I had barely enough energy to throw some food together and collapse in front of the TV to watch some bizarre Russian adaptation of an 80s or early 90s American sitcom. Seriously, that's a thing in Russia. The apartment had some strange quirks, which I was discovering little by little while I lived there. When I first moved in, I walked through the entire apartment with my iPhone and took video to send back home to my folks. My mother in particular was desperate to know I had found a decent place to live. As I was moving through the apartment, there were definite cold spots, particularly in one of the 2 bedrooms and the main living area. Another strange thing was that both of the apartment's 2 closets were still full of the previous tenants' clothing and shoes. One closet had clothing that appeared to belong to an older man, and the other one, an older woman. These were the only belongings that seemed to have been left behind, and when I asked the apartment manager what I should do with them, His equally odd answer was, "Et couvertiri sechas." It's your apartment now. I tried to give these items away, but people in the building were completely uninterested. The majority of this stuff ended up meeting its end in the building incinerator chute. It was around this same time that, seemingly from nowhere, the stench began. I actually gave it a name because it became a common enough, though entirely random event for the rest of my time renting that apartment. The smell was overpowering, but nothing too specific. I couldn't say it smelled like death or something rotting because it didn't. It had an odd metallic smell to it for sure, and it could easily make you sick if you stayed around it too long. Beyond that, the odor is beyond my powers of description. At first, I simply assumed the crazy lady who lived down the hall was correct, that the building was infested with huge mice and one had died in my wall or under some appliance. So I moved my refrigerator and oven, emptied and searched my cupboards and cabinets, checked the exhaust duct for the stove vent. I even took apart my sink drain. Nothing. No cause. The other very odd thing about this stench was that it seemed to move around the kitchen area. Most of the time, it was confined to the ceiling area over my refrigerator. I'd sniff it out to that spot, but there were no vents or anything that would allow the smell to come through. Sometimes, however, it would be in the far corner of the kitchen, or sometimes in the dining room. It would last a few hours and vanish. After a few days of searching, I did finally contact the building's maintenance guy. He showed up, looked around, but of course, as is typical, there was no trace of the smell. The next day it returned and was just as strong as ever. I called them back, and once again the odor was gone. This time, however, I refused to allow the maintenance guy to leave right away. I showed him some corroded fixtures in my shower and asked him to work on that, hoping the smell would return while he happened to be inside my apartment. The smell did return, with a vengeance. An overpowering stench filled the entire kitchen and drove me out. My eyes started watering and my throat began to burn the longer I stood there. I ran to the bathroom and brought the maintenance guy with me, who was at a total loss for words at what he whiffed. He told me he had been working in that same building for almost 15 years and never experienced anything close to what we were now being exposed to. The next day, a contractor was called in, and the two of them removed a section of plaster from the kitchen near my refrigerator. The wall was empty, no sign of any dead thing, nor of any mold or other cause for the smell. They removed a section of plaster from the far corner of the kitchen as well, and it was equally fruitless. After patching both walls, he tried dumping industrial strength cleaner down my drains. I could tell he was grasping at straws, but I too was desperate for some level of relief. So I stayed silent and let them work the problem through a process of elimination. Several days of troubleshooting and the odor did seem to fade on its own. I assumed the relief came about thanks to the efforts of maintenance and their contractor, so I thanked them both and closed the claim. That horrible smell stayed gone for almost 4 months before manifesting itself again. It always seemed to happen that way. Months of nothing, and then about 1 solid week of grotesque on and off stench which would move around the kitchen. Then as quickly as it had come, it was gone. To this day, I have no idea where the smell came from or what was causing it. I've been tempted to contact the new tenants and see if they're going through the same issues, but sometimes I wonder if knowing would really make things better or worse. Dealing with the strange odor in my kitchen and sometimes dining room was an ongoing issue. I tried chemical deodorizers and scented candles, incense, etc. It always seemed to come back. Then one day, with no more warning than I'd had when it started, it was over, at least for a few months. The smell was gone and I finally had my apartment, all of my apartment, to myself again. It definitely made me wonder about the building, if it was haunted. My family was pretty superstitious growing up, so it wasn't a stretch. My grandfather used to tell me stories as a child about his home growing up and the strange things he and his siblings would see. I was spending less and less time at my apartment anyway, so it wasn't much of a concern. About 3 months passed without incident. Things were going very well at the station and I was developing a group of friends. I started dating a woman who worked at the office complex across the street from the station, and we'd catch dinner together several times a week. She would be getting off work and I'd be getting ready to head in for my night shift on the air. I remember the first night she came over to my apartment very well, as it was the first time I heard a strange noise in the middle of the night. We had hung out all night, went to a movie, came back to the apartment and ate, then watched some TV before she went home. That night at around 1 a.m., I heard this strange mechanical buzzing or whirring noise. It was very brief, probably only a few seconds, and I probably would have dismissed it as part of a dream if it hadn't started again a few minutes later. A very high-pitched whirring noise that lasted a few seconds, then stopped cold. I laid there in bed with my eyes shut, trying to figure out if the noise was coming from inside my apartment, or maybe a neighbor. While I waited in the dark, eventually I drifted back to sleep. The next night it happened again, a high-pitched whirring noise. It woke me up, but unlike the prior night, it didn't stop right away, but kept going, continuously. I pulled myself out of bed and searched the apartment for the sound, finally tracking it to my bathroom. I had a cordless shaver which sat in a charging dock. I have a sort of scruffy beard and goatee, so I don't shave every day. I hadn't shaved a few days prior to this incident actually, so the shaver had simply been sitting there powered off. There it sat now, however, in its cradle, running at full speed. When I saw it, I admit, I stepped back and a shock of WTF went through my mind and down my spine. I rushed over to the shaver, grabbed it up and pushed the power button to turn it off, but it wouldn't power down. It kept running in my hand. I turned on the bathroom light and turned the shaver over in my hands, trying to figure out what was going wrong. I pushed and held power, and bashed the button over and over again, trying to make it power down. I tried plugging it in. I tried taking off the blades, eventually resorting to banging the shaver against the edge of the sink. Nothing would work to silence the shaver. Finally, being the patient person I am, I filled the sink with water and dropped the shaver in. No matter how water-resistant it was, after a minute or so it was overtaken by the water and finally fell silent. I actually left the shaver floating in that water overnight and made my way back to bed. The next morning, I took the shaver and the charging dock and threw the entire mess into the trash chute. I met Lydia and we went to the local gum. Closest thing would be a shopping mall in the States to buy a new shaver, among other things. We returned to my apartment late that afternoon, and she asked if she could stay over while I went to the station to do a night shift. We hung out for a while, and eventually I left her there while I went to work. Before I left, however, I set up the new shaver and charging dock in the bathroom so it could begin its initial charge. When I returned around 3 a.m., I was surprised to see Lydia still awake. It seems that at some point in the evening, the shaver had powered on by itself and she couldn't get it to shut off. She ended up putting it in a drawer so it could run until the battery died. I took the shaver from the drawer and powered it on and off several times. It seemed to work normally. Lydia suggested it was defective and I should return it in the morning, but when I told her I had thrown away my other shaver for behaving exactly the same way, she didn't like that answer. Actually, she refused to come back to my place for at least a few weeks. The apartment always seemed to act up around her as well. Light switches, which would work perfectly well for me, would glitch when she tried to turn them on. She'd flip the switch and the light would come on, but then immediately turn back off again. She'd have to flick the switch 4 or 5 times before the light would come on and stay on. I called building maintenance countless times trying to fix it, but the problem would always come back after a few days. She was a trooper though, and she did stick it out, even if the apartment played these little tricks on her. She eventually moved in with me on a part-time basis. The strangest stuff, however, didn't start until after our next-door neighbors moved out of their apartment a couple years later. That was the craziness that eventually made us pack everything and move. Life in Russia was a lot like life in the US. The similarities between the way people spoke, what they said, how they dressed, what they liked to do for fun, was pretty much spot on. There were some odd differences that took way more time to get used to than I was happy about. One time, I went to the corner convenience market to grab some milk for cereal and tea. A relatively simple act. Normally, yes, however not in Russia. It turns out there are 2 kinds of milk, both widely available and usually located right next to each other in any beverage or dairy cooler. Both are called milk or moloko. However, one is nastelnoi and one is tertoy. The bottles look pretty much the same. They even both come in whole cream or 1.5%. So I purchased some milk and poured it over my cereal one morning and took a bite. I was instantly greeted with the most sour, curdled, revolting sensation I've ever experienced. My eyes teared up, my nostrils flared, and I had to rush to the sink to expel my breakfast before the floor, or my lap, could greet it first. Nastelnoi is table milk, and that's what people in the US would put in tea or on their cereal. If only I had purchased that. I had bought tertoy milk, tart, which is intentionally soured with additives such as vinegar. That's right, the Russians love a good sour milk to drink while on the go. The stuff is a little like sour cream, but liquid. Another odd quirk is that the younger generation does not stay put for very long. People in our building were constantly moving in, moving out. They'd find a better flat at a slightly better rate and they were gone. I guess no one ever bothered to calculate the costs associated with moving. I was well into my second year living in Vladivostok. Things were going great. My girlfriend was finally moving into my apartment while we looked for something bigger that we could afford with our new combined income. Her place was a tiny studio near the factory district, so it wasn't really a candidate. The strange phantom odor that seemed to plague the flat still cropped up from time to time, but we soon discovered that incense seemed to drive it away. It also masked the smell quite nicely. Directly next door to me lived an amazing couple who were in their early 30s and who spoke some English. We hung out quite a lot when I wasn't sleeping from my crazy hours. Practically every other night we'd go out as a group to the cinema or shopping districts and spend hours together. 2 months after my girlfriend moved in, they moved out. It was more than a little devastating. They were the perfect neighbors, and although they did shuffle around a lot at night, it was usually just some low, muffled bumping noises. Who knows how loud a new tenant would be? We never got to find out. Shortly after they had completed the process of moving out, we began to notice strange sounds during the middle of the night. The same low, thumping, dragging noises could be heard through the wall from the apartment next door. At first, we thought they might be contractors, working to get the apartment rentable for new tenants. However, the noises seemed to go on all night. I was usually gone until very late at night, and when I did get home, I was so exhausted no amount of thumping through a wall was going to keep me up. My girlfriend was another story, however. She'd toss and turn all night. Eventually moving out to the living room to pass out, trying to get as far from the shared wall as she could. We eventually complained to the apartment manager, who took us immediately to the vacant flat. Of course, the place was completely deserted. My first thought was mice or rats. After all, I'd been warned from my first day living there that dog-sized rats were common in the building. Traps were set, and a small digital video camera was placed, the idea being that if a vagrant was breaking in at night, the manager could show it to police. 2 or 3 nights passed, and as usual, there were plenty of bumping and dragging noises coming from the apartment next door. Each day, we would all enter the apartment and check the traps. Nothing. We'd check the camera, and while it did seem to capture some of the noises, there was no indication of where they were coming from. After about a week, we'd had enough and finally convinced the apartment manager to give us a copy of the key. We planned to wait until the noises got to their loudest and run into the apartment to confront whoever was banging around all night. We didn't have to wait long. The noises started at around 8:30 p.m. and got steadily louder. At about 10 p.m. we sneaked into the hallway and unlocked the door, turning the lock very slowly to avoid making too much noise. There was a fire escape, and we were sure that if the occupant was alerted, they'd be gone before we could get there. We swung open the door and flipped on the overhead lights. Nothing. Not a thing. No noises, no movement, no activity at all except for the lone camera on a tripod to one corner of the room. My girlfriend was looking a little ragged, and truth be told, I wasn't in great shape either. The lack of sleep was putting incredible pressure on her, and in turn on me. We actually ended up renting a hotel room for a weekend just to get away and give my poor girlfriend a chance to sleep through the night. Before going home, We made arrangements to meet up with our friends, the former tenants of the apartment which was causing us so much trouble. We met up at a cafe and went over the entire story from start to finish. By the end, our friends had a look of shock and a little fear in their faces. I still remember exactly what they said next. It was freaky enough to make us pack up that night and go back to the hotel for good. "Those sounds you heard, we know them well," my friend Petra said. "But they were not coming from our apartment. They came from yours. We heard them every night. It kept us awake, and that is why we moved. The walls were too thin." It took several weeks to terminate our lease at the apartment complex. We only returned to the flat for brief visits to collect belongings, as neither of us had really provided any furniture. That wasn't a big deal. Clothing, electronics, some decorative junk we had collected together to enhance the space was all we needed. While we fought with the apartment manager over our last month's rent, we were staying at a small hotel by the waterfront. It was off-season for tourists, so the prices were reasonable, but still taking their toll as the time we spent there dragged on and on. As the fall season arrived, we were invited up to the dacha, summer house, of my girlfriend's grandmother. It was in a medium-sized village north of the city and easily reachable by train. We both figured it would be a great escape from the stresses of the city and our prior apartment, so we accepted the invitation, and by the third week in September, we were off to Grandma's house. I'd stayed in a dacha before, and they're usually pretty similar. A small wooden cabin or cottage, often with a thatched roof, really intricate carved woodwork, and dense ancient forests sprawling all around. Ludia's grandmother didn't have a dacha, she had a mansion. It was obviously built in the same style, but it was 3 stories tall and had at least 15 rooms. Imagine a log cabin on steroids, with hand-carved posts and massive beveled glass windows, and you'll have some idea. The first thing I noticed about Babushka, Grandma, was that she loathed American music. She talked about it for hours on end. Elvis in particular was one of her favorites. Next was that she likes to flirt with her granddaughter's boyfriend a little too much. She was grabby and spouted off weird innuendos and dirty jokes like no 78-year-old I'd ever met before. The first night we were there in her home, we told her about our experiences in the apartment building. She didn't seem fazed by it, nodding and smiling and agreeing with a lot of our comments. When we had relayed most of the story, she stopped us, pausing to look deeply into the fireplace like she was examining the flames for some deeper meaning. "You know, this house is haunted," she said to us. I'm not really sure what Ludia was thinking, but I was thinking, what? Why would she say that to us after what we had been through? Babushka began to tell us a story about the weeks just before her husband died. She had a small, collapsible tray overloaded in medications necessary to keep her husband alive. The tray was set up near the head of the bed on her side, so she could quickly access them if needed. Often, before she would go to sleep, a figure would come into the room from the door just past the foot of her bed and stop, staring at her. She said the figures were always children, and they wore traditional Cossack costumes, probably dating from the late 1800s. 1, 2, sometimes 3 of them would come in standing side by side and cautiously approach the foot of the bed, sometimes stopping and placing their hands on the top of the footboard while they stared intently at her and her husband. She would call out to them, asking what they wanted, how she could help them, but they would never respond. She said the encounter always ended the same way, with her trying to wake her ailing husband, and when she turned back to the foot of the bed, they were gone. One night they came again, and she was so frustrated and frightened by their regular appearance that she shouted out at them, "Leave me alone." "Be gone from here," she shouted to us while she told the story, gesturing with her hands. The tray, overloaded with medications, then slid across the floor 1/2 meter and came crashing to the ground, pills and bottles flying everywhere. That was the last time she saw the children, and her husband died less than a week later. She had several more stories as well, slowly recounting them as she tended the fire and occasionally took a photo from amongst the many that sit on the shelves around the living room. She would point to one and explain how this relative or that relative had returned to speak to her, or how they themselves had witnessed something strange in the dark Siberian forest. She told us about her own brother, Ludia's great-uncle, who had been working for the civil militia, police, in the 1960s guarding train depots. He would come home almost nightly with strange tales of various things he would see while alone in the dark station houses. Phantoms of long-dead passengers, queuing up in line to take their tickets or move across the platform to their train. He would hear the whistles of steam engines that hadn't run for 30 years, hear people whispering, and even said he would suddenly fall ill during his watch. Babushka told us how he would find belongings, artifacts along the train lines. Watches, eyeglasses, rings, lighters. At first he would bring them home, but after a while runs of bad luck would convince him to return the items back to where he had found them. When he had finally been removed from train duty, he had sworn he would never step foot in a depot again. The stories were frightening, mysterious, and even more so the way they were told. I looked around the large living room of her dacha, at all the objects on the walls and in the cupboards, dancing in the firelight with large, oversized shadows, and I admit I was terrified. Throughout the 1800s, Siberia was a favored place for the Russian government to send its undesirables, such as minorities, illegitimate children, even with royal blood, and vagrants. She said once the Trans-Siberian Railroad was completed, the trains ran day and night, carrying poor souls exiled to this region. Ludia interrupted her grandmother, scolding her for making up stories and trying to scare us. Her grandmother just smiled back, fluffing up her blanket and rolling her eyes. "Tak molod," she said a couple times while shaking her head. "Tak molod, tak molod," so young. It was my first real introduction to the dark, Gothic, superstitious way of thinking that most Russians in this part of the world held. Babushka then continued saying, "Be careful," and that the dead are envious of the living, that they will do almost anything they can to feel warm again. The scene was pretty surreal, but so very, very Russian. If I had grown up in this region, I probably would have been taught from an early age about how to ward against evil spirits and phantoms. I would have been told that they were all around me, and that every ancient forest throughout the country was a place where they gathered. I was just about sick to my stomach when Ludia's grandmother stopped and stood up, going into the kitchen and returning with a freshly baked pumpkin stuffed with fruits and nuts. "You want some dessert?" She chuckled as she offered us some. I wasn't very hungry, and suffice to say, I didn't sleep well that night. Strangely though, Ludia got an excellent night's sleep. Odd what people can take comfort in. After a couple months of searching, we finally found a new place to live within the city of Vladivostok. We wanted to be near to both of our jobs and be in proximity to at least a few stores. Neither of us owned a car, so when we found an apartment flat near the city's trolley network, it seemed like the best of both worlds. The building was brand new, one of the high-rise apartment blocks under construction all over the city. As we were touring with the building manager, he took us through several flat layout options, including 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, etc. There was no paint on the walls yet, just sheetrock with the random spatter of plaster covering screw holes here or there. We found a corner unit on the 10th floor, with a view of a nearby park, and we completed all the necessary paperwork. Now we just had to work out the move-in schedule and wait for the apartment to be finished. I ended up staying in the city midweek, at the same tiny hotel where we had been staying following our last move-out. Ludia spent much of her time at Babushka's dacha in the country, taking the 45-minute train ride back and forth to her job. On the weekends, we'd meet up there and spend time together. It wasn't ideal, but it was temporary, and we were making it work. The short fall season had come to a close and winter was already settling harshly across the coastline. Daytime temperatures dropped from a comfortable 15 Celsius during the days to about 5, and it froze every night. We started to make plans for the long, complicated winter holidays, which are so uniquely Russian. The first of these being the Feast of St. Nicholas in early December. If I had to relate it to any American holiday, I'd say it's probably like Thanksgiving, mostly revolving around a large family meal. As the snows began to blanket the Primorsky territory, Ludia and I spent more and more time exploring the area around Babushka's village. The forest was absolutely breathtaking, covered in snow, like something from a fairy tale. Massive groves of pine, deep greens mixed with sharp white snow. Picturesque icy ponds with random deer or red foxes wandering about as they've done since life evolved in that ancient place. One of the places both Ludia and I wanted to visit was the Dead Village, which several villagers had told us about. No one could remember the official name of the town, and it had been abandoned since about 1930. One villager said it was vacated due to a massive influenza outbreak. Another told us it was abandoned due to the risk of sinkholes which threatened to swallow the entire village at any moment. Babushka didn't say much about it when we'd ask. "It is dead," she would say. "Would it make it less dead if you knew why?" It was easy enough to locate. The two villages had once been sister towns. There was still the rough outline of a country road which connected both locations. Easiest access was actually by horseback, which was itself a new experience for me. Ludia drove while I sat behind her. The journey was a bit slow going in the light, fluffy snow, and we had to stop several times. Finally, around noon, we came to the remains of a checkpoint. These cookie-cutter checkpoints were classic to the early Soviet Union. They provided a sort of guard post, an emergency stopping location, in case travelers needed help along the road. They were painted bright blue and could hold a couple MITZU, Soviet police troops. Several of the old posts were still visible around other villages in the area, though they had been long abandoned. This one was little more than an outline, as the ceiling had obviously collapsed decades ago, allowing the wooden skeleton to rot and fail. The village itself was a ghost. You could make out where roads had been once by the tree lines. There were a few twisted frames of what looked like horse-drawn wagons or farm equipment. After 90 years, there wasn't much left that hadn't been claimed by the trees or been blasted to dust by the harsh winters. The entire area was completely still, the only sound coming from the feet of our horse as we made our way through the frozen remains of the town. Around the corner from a massive live oak, we found a stone house. Unlike the other wooden structures which had all but been reclaimed by the forest, this building stood mostly intact. The front-facing windows were lined in stained glass, which Ludia said meant it was most likely the country home of some aristocrat, probably repurposed after its former owner was arrested or shot in the revolution. We stopped, dismounted, and explored the exterior of the ruins. One of the outer walls had collapsed and gave us full access to the first floor. Looking upward, a flood of light filtered down through the rotted floorboards, nothing blocking it out as the roof was completely gone over the first room. The narrow rays of light played tricks in the shadows, making it look like the walls were moving, dancing as we passed by. As we walked through the main entry hall, Ludia took several steps up what remained of the stairwell and stopped. I was distracted looking at what appeared to be bullet holes in the plaster near the front door. Ludia called my name a few times before I finally heard her and passed back around to where she was standing. She was frozen in place, her foot actually hanging where it had stopped as she had prepared to step up. Her eyes were locked on a dark area, just through a crooked doorway at the top of the stairs. "Do you see it?" she asked me in a whisper. "See what?" I asked her back. I stared up at the open doorway, straining my eyes to make out anything, but there was only blackness. "There's someone standing there looking at us." She motioned with her hand as she said it. Moving closer to Ludia, I took a position directly next to her, standing on the same step. Nothing. I took another step up. The wood of the stairs was spongy and giving way more than I liked. At about the 5th step, I stopped. I could see something, perhaps what she was talking about. It had a shape, and it was roughly the size and outline of a man. The edges weren't clear, so it was hard to make out an exact size or the dimensions. The form was a dark, smoky gray against the black of the hallway behind it. It definitely appeared to be watching us. Standing or floating or whatever you'd call it just at the top of the steps, I stood there dumbfounded. I had never seen anything like that before. My mind churned over the possibilities, but I was aware of a nagging fear as well. Something told me I should leave, but I couldn't turn my attention away. Ludia called out to the figure from behind me, asking who or what it was. The sound of her voice is what it took to snap me back from my transfixed stare. Backing down the stairs, I took her hand and directed her a few steps back toward our entry point. "We should go." I said to her, and she agreed. Before we moved on, however, she raised her camera from its place around her neck and snapped a photo. The intense light from the flash shocked my eyes, and it took several seconds for them to recover. When they had, I returned my gaze to the stairwell. The figure was gone. We made our way back out of the ruins and to the horse. For the ride back, we couldn't stop talking about it. To this day, when I close my eyes and think back to it, I can picture things so clearly. Babushka, as usual, was not impressed when we told her what we saw. Nezvanye ghosti, she said to us. Even ghosts hate uninvited guests. It was December at last in the far eastern Russian territory of Primorsky, and I was very keen to experience a Christmas, or whatever they called it, now that I had friends and a girlfriend to share it with. I knew we'd be expected to spend time with Babushka, but that was a sacrifice I was willing to make. The feast of St. Nicholas came and went relatively well, a sort of Russian Thanksgiving, where family and friends gathered at a massive feast and talked about good times, bad times, and Babushka's neighbor got drunk, naked, and passed out in her sauna. Thankfully, we found him in time before he got too dehydrated. Ah, the holidays. It turns out the holiday season in Russia only starts with the feast of St. Nick. Then there's New Christmas, Novoye Rождество, which Catholics and some other Western religions celebrate on December 25th. Then there's New Year's, which during the Soviet Union was the biggest winter celebration of the year. Since Christmas was banned as a religious holiday, religion was illegal. The Russians celebrated exactly as they would at Christmas, but on January 1st instead. Then, of course, there's Old Christmas, still celebrated on January 6th, as it was on the old calendar. All these dates confused me. Did we get gifts on all 3 days? Could I get gifts on all 3 days even if no one else did? These were critical questions which must be answered. The Christmas holiday breaks are so long, and so many people are off work during the entire period on paid vacations. Many Russians get bored about halfway through and long for returning to work. Really long for it. I also discovered that Christmas time, or New Year's time, was a traditionally superstitious period on the calendar. Party games popular during these festive, family-filled times of the year included fortune-telling, unique rituals designed to keep evil spirits away, and of course one of the favorite holiday pastimes, the Ouija board. Now don't worry, this won't be another Ouija board story. Though every December to January, tens of thousands of Russians do partake. Babushka even had one at her house, a traditionally round one that looked very old and had seen many seances over the years. It was around this festive time of year that I had my own Christmas horror. Although Lydia and I were swamped, trying to move into our new apartment building, we spent as much time with Babushka as we could. Pretty much every weekend we spent up at her dacha, going over the different holidays and how we'd arrange and schedule each one. In Babushka's household, they traditionally gave gifts in January, as they were an old and established Russian Orthodox family. We ended up working out a compromise where Lydia and I would celebrate on December 25th, and we would have another celebration in January with her grandmother. Around January 2nd, we gathered our gifts and hired a taxi to take us out to the village. There was so much to transport, the train wasn't really realistic. Babushka greeted us at the door and supervised as we brought everything in. She was her typical forward self, lingering after kissing me in welcome and grabbing at me as I passed by her. She'd make comments like silny, oh how strong, and I'd respond by calling her terpki, slang for tart or other things. She'd laugh and her beady little eyes would twinkle. She loved every moment of it. When we were done, I set myself up in one of the downstairs bedrooms. I've always been terrible at wrapping gifts. They end up looking like I had used my feet, with tape everywhere and seams exposed, revealing the items within. Dreading that prospect, I waited until the last minute and now had to finish wrapping everything for Babushka and Lydia's other immediate family. After a few minutes of focused failure, I heard a knock at the door. Lydia and her grandmother were going into the village center to pick up dinner. I let her know what I wanted, and shortly after, I heard the front door to the dacha close. It didn't sink in at first, but this was the only time I'd been alone in Babushka's house. I'd stayed there many times over the last couple months, but there had always been at least one other person there with me. I worked steadily for 15 or so minutes before I was disturbed again by a tapping sound. I stopped and looked up, trying to work out where the noise might be coming from. The room wasn't very large and the windows were sealed tightly, so it couldn't be a draft. A few seconds later it resumed. Tap, tap, tap. I stood and walked over to the large picture window across the room from me and slid back the curtains. The windows were mostly iced over, but there didn't appear to be any movement. Testing the latches on each of the 3 windows, I verified they were securely latched. I just slid the curtains back into their original position when I heard the tapping again. Tap, tap, tap. The sound definitely seemed as though it were coming from somewhere behind me. The door, perhaps. I exited the small bedroom and looked down the hall. At first, I assumed it was Babushka playing a trick on me. Tap, tap, tap. Leaving the hallway that led to the bedroom, I stepped out into the large living room where Babushka liked to entertain her guests. Every wall of the room was covered in a lifetime's worth of small trinkets, photos, religious icons, and the like. No fire was going, so the large room was quite cold, and I remember shivering a bit and rubbing my arms. Suddenly, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A form, dark against the color of the light coming from the bedroom's open door down the hallway. I snapped my head around but could see nothing, only the long, narrow hallway and the glow of the lamps in the room where I had been working. The house was pretty disturbing all alone. So many odd angles and objects covering every surface. The shadows played strange tricks, moving while you were looking away and snapping to perfect stillness when I turned my attention to them. I walked in a circle around the living room, turning on lamps as I went. Even with all of them lit, the room only had a slight glow to it, not even enough light to read in. Babushka did like things dark. Tap, tap, tap. The sound had returned. I made my way out of the living room and toward the house's front door. The door was not locked, as is typical out in these villages, and I could make out the halo of a street lamp through the iced-over glass in the center of the door. Turning the knob very slowly, I pulled it open in an instant, expecting to catch some neighbor kid playing a trick. The outer world was entirely still. Light snow was falling, soft and dry as talcum powder drifting down from the inky black sky above. No moon or stars, only the snow, and the amber glow of the village's sodium streetlights reflecting off the powder, giving everything a sharp golden aura. The only footsteps in the snow belonged to Lydia and her grandmother, moving from the front steps and down the street toward the center of town. Even those footprints were quickly filling up, being erased by the night's winter storm. I searched around the perimeter of the house. No other footprints were visible. There were no birds, no animals around that I could see, only perfect stillness. My limbs were getting quite numb by the time I made it back to the front door of the house. I hadn't put on a jacket or anything prior to going out, and I was now feeling the results. Stepping back into the entry hall, I closed the door behind me and took a few steps back toward the living room. From this position in the house, I could tell the tapping sounds were not tapping after all. They were the sound of footsteps. It sounded as though there were someone in the room directly above the front entry hallway. The steps started and stopped, like someone was pacing, or possibly swaying, dancing to a rhythm. I moved very quietly back to the first floor bedroom and collected my cell phone as quietly as I could. If there was an intruder in the house, I wasn't going to let them know I was there. Taking each step very cautiously, I made my way up to the second floor and down the hall toward Babushka's bedroom, the room directly over the front entry. Her door was wide open, and her curtains were all pulled back, allowing plenty of light from the street to enter the room. The first thing I noticed was a moving shadow, crossing back and forth in front of the wall across from the doorway. Back and forth in a steady rhythm, it flowed over the surface of the wall directly across from me. Taking a few more cautious steps, I lifted my phone and tapped 102 inches, police emergency, into the touch surface, ready to place the call if necessary. Moving closer to the doorway of her room, I changed my position so I could see further around the corner. The source of the shadow was coming from some kind of blanket, or shawl, or something that was hanging over the arm of a chair, swaying back and forth as if a steady wind was blowing on it, but all the windows were sealed. That was about enough for me. I turned immediately, rushed down the stairs and out the front door, following what was left of the footprints to meet up with Ludia and her grandmother. When I explained what had happened, she sighed, rolled her eyes and scoffed. "Jedzie skazal, ci to dom presleduje." I told you the house was haunted.
So this next one was posted on the channel back in June, but I'm going in chronological order with this guy's story, so here it is again. And you can skip to the final story if you don't want to listen to it again.
The village of Zelenoye is just another one of the thousands of nondescript tiny villages which can be found hidden away here or there in the dense evergreen forests of Siberia. Indeed, from the main road you wouldn't even know a town existed if not for the tiny, poorly maintained dirt road and handmade sign. Not much of an indication that at least a dozen or so people lived in the dense wood, but at least enough for a postal worker to know about. The town itself is not the topic of this story, though I could probably spend at least a week recounting the various local legends and superstitions that thrive in that tiny, closed society. It was about the end of January when my girlfriend's brother, Alexei, suggested that I might enjoy a visit to an abandoned train station. He knew I had a particular interest in urban exploration, left over from my days in California. After one of Babushka's various story nights where she would recount the local folklore, she mentioned members of the family who had worked for the local police and who had reported ghostly figures and sounds from inside closed-down depots. For decades, it was a common pastime for the imperial family to send undesirables by train, coach, or by foot into exile deep into Siberia. Many of those locations still exist, and one of them is a short way from a tiny village called Zelenoye. We were advised to pack light, though by now I was well aware of the tone of sarcasm in Russia. I expected light meant to come prepared for a sled dog race, though when I showed up at Alexei's home, I found most of the group in jeans and hoodies. It was no warmer than 1 degree centigrade. I pictured a quaint little town locked among the pines, snow hanging heavy on the branches, and children and villagers milling about preparing their wares for a farmer's market. Nope, totally wrong. The turnoff for the village quite literally is a notch in the tree line, with a dirt road meandering through. The snow was more like a dense freezing slush due to a warm rainstorm, which had hit the area a couple of days before, leaving massive puddles the size of our tiny Isuzu dotting our path. Alexei was quite accustomed to the conditions, though, navigating those pitfalls like a New York taxi driver escaping rush hour traffic. The road was long and winding, and the insulation from the dense forest kept every sound hidden until we were practically in the middle of town. We parked next to an abandoned Soviet-era militia checkpoint shack, sort of an unofficial marker to designate the boundary of the village. The trip from the main paved road to this location took almost an hour to traverse, though it was only about 2 kilometers in distance. Strapping on our backpacks, we made out in a seemingly random direction. There were no markers and no trails to guide us. Only the experience of Alexei, our guide who had been to this spot before. The frozen soil was slippery and tended to collapse under our weight as we sloshed our way deeper into the darkness of the overgrowth. Eventually, we came to a clearing, though one that was obviously man-made. A narrow trough about 6 meters wide and running in a mostly straight line. Kicking at the frozen muck on the clearing floor, Alexei managed to clear a small section of railroad track. The steel was in an advanced state of decomposition as, according to Alexei, the track had not been used in 75 years, actually closer to 90. Years of annual thaw, heavy storms, and complete abandonment had made this once busy railroad corridor just another part of the forest. Following in the direction of the tracks and after hiking for what seemed like another eternity, we finally came across the station. It was far more substantial than I had expected. Being from Cali, I'd seen frontier train depots from this same era in the 1870s, and they were usually thrown together from whatever materials they had available locally. This structure was somewhat large, about the size of a large house and made from limestone, covered in a shell of what was probably once a polished green granite. The front of the station had what was once an extremely ornate facade, covered in granite with a large clock and what looked like gilded Cyrillic lettering spelling out "Train Terminal." As is typical of abandoned property in that era, almost no effort was made to secure the building against people entering. There were no boards up over the windows, and the heavy wooden doors had been secured with just a single chain and padlock, which had been broken long before our arrival. Officials pretty much closed up shop one day and never returned. Down the middle of the structure was a large hall with vaulted ceilings and what remained of a brass gas chandelier. At some point in the early Soviet era, they had hastily converted this room to electricity with exposed wires dangling from holes in the plaster and drooping in long, menacing loops toward the floor, cobbled together with a tarnished electric light fixture here or there. Along either wall were rows of benches, still showing their antique lacquer and highly decorative iron scrollwork feet and armrests. This was obviously the waiting room, with two large platforms on either end. The platforms were at one point glassed in, though the heavy handmade glass panels had apparently rotted from their sashes and collapsed inward years ago. The platforms, through years of exposure to the harsh Russian elements, were sad, sunken pits with rotten planks growing small ferns and mushrooms. We didn't try to make our way out there as the flooring was dubious to begin with. At the back of the long central waiting area was the ticket booth and a door leading to a set of spiral stairs. Taking the stairs up, we found the old station master's residence along with storage for the station's supplies and large brass kerosene tanks which still had something in them. Also in this room we found a series of tickets and ticket stubs, the dates on them ranging from 1880 to March of 1929. Of course, I wanted to keep them, but was told by the others in the group that taking things from haunted places was very bad luck. "Things will follow you," they said over and over again. I, of course, was thinking, souvenir. I ended up taking their advice and left empty-handed. The upper floors, being a residence, had a lot of personal touches. Framed black and white photos on the walls, brass candlesticks still sitting on the mantel of a coal fireplace. In the main room of the station master's apartment, we could hear what sounded like crying. It was rather loud, and something that none of us expected. So loud, in fact, that we all started searching, expecting to find someone lost and looking for their parents. It didn't dawn on us until after we had completed a search of the entire property that we were quite alone. Making our way back upstairs to continue our exploration, we heard the crying again. It definitely sounded like a child, and most of us swear they were saying something softly in Russian, though we couldn't make out the actual words. We took several shots with our phone cameras, hoping to capture an orb or a dark spot. Unfortunately, our moving around in these spaces kicked up considerable dust and every image was hampered by clouds of it. If people are interested, I'll see about posting a couple of the images here. Maybe you'll catch something we didn't. After coming back downstairs, we explored the main hall, waiting area. The sensations in this room were profound. The air felt heavy, like we were actually at the bottom of a swimming pool. The weight of the invisible water pushing down on us from all sides. One of Alexei's friends who had come along on our adventure had to leave the room as he was feeling quite unwell. He stood outside in the sub-zero temperatures for over an hour while we continued to look, unwilling to come back inside. The room had an overpowering smell of wood aged for over a century. The same smell you get after opening a long-closed cedar chest or walking into a store in an Old West town. It was a powerful odor that we actually didn't get used to over time, and our clothing carried the smell with us after leaving. Near the back, however, just around the gate to the ticket booth, the smell changed. The only way I can describe it is a dense floral perfume. It was the dead of winter, and although small shrubs and ferns were scattered around the property, inside and out, there were no flowers. We couldn't find any bottles of chemicals or anything else in the area that would account for it. We generally agreed it smelled like a commercial product, something created rather than natural to the area. We even walked around behind the station, to the point outside just opposite the location in the ticketing area, but could smell nothing. On the way back to the car, we took the long way around and passed through the village. It was different, to say the least. If any of you have ever seen the early 90s TV series Twin Peaks, imagine that show, dubbed in Russian, filmed in a village of maybe 20 people. Sitting in the car, desperately trying to get feeling back in my legs as we bumped and jostled down the road back to civilization, it really hit me for the first time. Babushka had been telling me about all these ghost stories, and had warned me many times that ghosts were simply part of everyday life in this part of the world. I finally understood what she meant. Tucked around every corner, past every dark, fog-shrouded tree line was the location of some tragedy. So many people have died here for so long, had their lives taken from them and been shipped off to this frightening wilderness to fend for themselves among the ghosts. No wonder the country itself is haunted. Moving into our new downtown high-rise flat was a serious pain. Seriously. It took over a month from the time we purchased the apartment to when we could even start moving our belongings in. Then we had to wait several more weeks for specific fixtures to arrive and get installed. The city was obviously experiencing a boom from new trade with China and Japan, and the housing growth was far exceeding the city's construction industry's capacity. The winter had been particularly cold as well, and although we were now in March, there was no sign of the freezing temperatures and snow intended to abate. Babushka had also fallen ill with a particularly nasty bug and even more nasty cure, which of course, thanks to her superstitious upbringing, meant she had to try all manner of strange, horrible-smelling salves and potions. Lydia took a small break from work to stay with her grandmother and help her during recovery. The memory of what I saw in her bedroom over the New Year holidays never fully left the back of my mind, however. Every time I'd make my way into her room to say hello or bring her a bowl of soup, I'd expect some presence to be felt, or some object to move. I refused to be left alone in that house again. Once the stress of the move had abated and we were successfully moved into our new home, work began to take on a much more structured and orderly pace, and our lives at last started to stabilize. It was time for my girlfriend and I to begin our adventure together. The first places we wanted to see were some of the former Soviet republics, which could be found along the country's southern and western borders, nations which, although freed in the early 1990s, never seemed to thrive in the same way that Russia proper had. Once the winter's icy grip had finally started to thaw, around late May we flew from Vladivostok to Chelyabinsk, far away in the Caucasus, and from there rented a car to drive to the border with Kazakhstan. The road was in excellent condition as this was obviously a vital trade route, and we purred along nicely in our rented Chevy Cruze. Honestly, I probably would have preferred a good old Soviet-era Lada to get more of the experience, but for whatever reason, none were to be had. At the border, we got quite a few stares from the security patrols and border police on both sides. It was obvious that very few tourists, or even European Russians, passed through this crossing. The region was populated almost entirely with native Tatar, Kazakh, and Bashkir people. Notwithstanding the curious questions and glances, a few passport scans and a check for fruits veg, and we were on our way south again, now in Kazakhstan. The first stop on our journey was to an abandoned sanitarium. Now, when you hear that term sanitarium, you most likely think of a privately run asylum, or perhaps a place where people with chronic illness would go to hopefully recover. However, in Europe and these Eurasian countries, they often had a very different use. They were simply locations where local citizens could go on a short vacation, escape from the stresses of the major industrial cities like Chelyabinsk or Omsk and relax. They usually included a lot of steam rooms, pools, tennis courts, and maybe a small football pitch. They were paid for by the workers' government-backed jobs, or were simply free in many cases, and were considered an essential part of a person's work year. With the fall of the Soviet Union, most of these places weren't brought up by private companies, and the government in most of these ex-satellite nations couldn't afford to maintain them. They were allowed to rot, and in some cases were filled with refugees from one post-Soviet war or another. This sanitarium, it appeared, was simply allowed to die a slow death. The grounds were secured, though in typical style. That really only meant a chain and padlock, both of which were long gone by the time we arrived. The white stucco facade in traditional Soviet Romanesque design was broken and scarred, with large cracks exposing the concrete and rebar skeleton within. Virtually every window had been broken out, most likely by area kids who had also taken it upon themselves to cover every inch of the interior walls with graffiti. The building had obviously been vandalized as well, following the fall, as most of the ornamental hammer and sickle emblems had been intentionally chiseled off the walls, and we'd come across the occasional bust of Stalin or Lenin, with the face broken away. Moving down into the lower levels, we came across the Great Theater, massive and paneled in false marble. The auditorium could probably have fit at least 2,000 people in its heyday, now silent and crumbling. Long, tattered, mold-covered velvet curtains hung precariously on either side of the performance stage. The stage itself had more broken than intact boards, and several of the heavy projector lights had fallen from their perches in the rigging above, to puncture through the mossy stage like cannonball scars. Just to the right of the stage stood a tall, multi-paneled window, which, as with the others in the building, was entirely devoid of glass. As the faint sunlight filtered through, forming long rays in the swirling dust and mold spores, my girlfriend spotted what appeared to be an outline of a man standing just to the side of the window frame. Tapping me on the shoulder, I turned to look at where she was motioning and caught a glimpse of the man myself. Calling up to him in Russian, we tried to get his attention, thinking at the time he was simply a local exploring. "Privet." "Hey," I called up the form. With no answer, I called up again, more formally this time. "Dobry den." "Good day." Still, there was no reply. For a moment, we wondered if this was perhaps a security guard, and that we were trespassing. The figure was rather clear in his position just beside the window, standing outside and looking down at us from perhaps 12 meters up the wall. Asking my girlfriend to wait there a moment, I stepped back through the entrance of the theater and made my way quickly around the corner of the building, to the exterior wall adjacent to where the window stood. Pulling my mobile phone from my pocket, along with my passport, in case it was security, I quickly made my way up to the point where the man was standing. I stopped in my tracks as I found a sheer wall, no place for a man or anything to be standing at the exterior of the building outside that window. No balcony or bridge or walkway. Not only was there nowhere to stand, but there was no man there. Tapping my girlfriend's number into my phone, I placed the call and waited anxiously while it rang. "Hello?" She answered softly. "Is the man still standing there?" I asked, trying not to give away the surprise and adrenaline in my voice. "Yes, he's still standing there, staring at me," she replied. I quickly explained that he could not be standing there, and why, the explanation causing her to ask me to stop and slow down several times. When it finally dawned on her what I was saying, she cursed softly into the phone and took off running toward the entrance. I also took off, closing the gap between us as quickly as I could. When I saw her there, emerging from the Grand Theater's gaping entrance, she was pale and shivering. We grabbed each other and both made our way back around to the exterior wall. We both knew what we'd find when we arrived, but something in our minds made us need to verify it to ourselves. As expected, there was only a wall, a broken window, and no man there waiting when we reached the spot again. We discussed what had happened at length, verifying with each other that we had indeed both seen what we had thought we had seen. When we were both convinced that neither of us were insane, we pressed on, back toward the larger of the buildings on the old Sanitarium campus. This building had obviously been the old administrative wing. It contained staff housing, offices, meeting space, and a lot of what looked to be rather official documents scattered all over the floor of several of the first-floor rooms. The doors had been completely removed from the hinges and taken, probably made from a valuable metal or containing ornate carvings. It was a prize too valuable to leave behind, and as was often the case with these abandoned structures, the treasures were immediately looted in the early 90s. One of the massive filing rooms contained what had to be 400 individual filing cabinets, lining both sides of a massive rectangular room. Between the rows of cabinets sat a dozen long tables with piles of old documents scattered all over. The roof had long failed, causing rain and snow to penetrate the room and turn these papers to mush, mixed with mold and grasses struggling to grow in a random scattering of penetrating sunbeams. Upon entering this room, both of us had an intense feeling of unease. There was definitely the sense that someone was watching us, though we were obviously the only two people in the room. Using our high-powered LED flashlights, we scoured every nook and cranny of the room, and the only people there were the two of us. The deeper into the records room, the harsher the sensation felt, until it was almost one of resentment and even loathing. Calling out to the unseen energy, I tried to determine what it was and what it wanted. Again in Russian, I spoke out. "Privet," I called out loudly. "Koti? Who are you? Vai kotite, shtobi my ushli? Do you want us gone?" We stood there in silence as my questions echoed through the room, our flashlights cutting beams of white light through the dark angular space. Suddenly, with no warning, we noticed movement at the far end of the room. A large portrait of what looked to be a Soviet official detached from its mount at the top of the frame, swung forward, and crashed down on a stack of rolling desk chairs which were piled on the floor just in front of it. The force of the crash sent several of the chairs careening off in different directions, and the rotten frame and canvas of the portrait cracked into several pieces, filling the room with an ear-shattering crash and the squeaking of the rusted chair wheels. Suffice to say, that was enough of an experience for the both of us, and we quickly and efficiently made our way back to the rental car. A couple of minutes later, we were back on the road to Kostanay, where we would stay for the night. I would say sleep, but neither of us got much sleep that night.
I just want to quickly thank everyone for sticking around the last 4 years. I really appreciate your comments every night. Without them, I probably wouldn't have kept this up for so long. Bonne nuit, midnight crew, and have a happy Halloween.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.